Imagine, for a moment, being an engineer in the German Luftwaffe in the middle of World War II. You're part of an air force that, for years, dominated the skies over Europe. You've designed and flown some of the most advanced aircraft of their time, nimble Messerschmitts, robust. You believe in German engineering, in its precision, its innovation, its inherent superiority. Then, a new enemy aircraft falls into your hands. It's American, a P-47 Thunderbolt. You and your team are tasked with taking it apart, studying every single component. You start with a certain arrogance, a belief that you'll find flaws, inefficiencies, proof of Allied inferiority. But as the days turn into weeks, as each bolt is loosened and each panel removed, a chilling realization begins to dawn. You've never, in all your years of designing and building warplanes, seen anything quite like this. You've never encountered raw power, applied with such intelligent, brutal efficiency, in a single machine. It wasn't just a plane, it was a revelation, and it forced you to confront a truth you weren't ready for. This isn't just a story about an airplane. It's a story about a clash of philosophies, of industrial might, and ultimately, a moment of stark realization for some of the most brilliant minds in Nazi Germany. It's about how one machine, the P-47 Thunderbolt, didn't just fight a war. It fundamentally shifted perceptions of what an aircraft could be and what it could endure. For years leading up to the war, and certainly in its early stages, the German aviation industry operated with a distinct philosophy. Their focus was largely on speed, agility, and climb rate, especially for their single-engine fighters. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, the backbone of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, was a masterpiece of lightweight construction, designed to be an interceptor, a quick-strike weapon. It was lean, mean, and incredibly effective in the hands of skilled pilots. German engineers prized efficiency, often equating it with a certain minimalist elegance. They built aircraft that were, in many ways, finely tuned instruments, capable of dazzling performance in specific parameters. They also had a deep-seated belief in the superiority of inline, liquid-cooled engines, viewing radial engines, common in American and British designs, as clunky and aerodynamically inefficient. This wasn't entirely unfounded. Early radial engines often presented more drag, but it fostered a cultural blind spot, an unwillingness to fully appreciate the advantages a different approach might offer. When the war began, this philosophy seemed to pay off handsomely. The Luftwaffe swept across Europe, dominating the skies over Poland, France, and the Low Countries. Their fighters were fast, their bombers effective, and their pilots, many of them veterans of the Spanish Civil War, were highly trained. There was a palpable sense of invincibility, a belief that German ingenuity and engineering prowess were simply unmatched. This early success, while devastating for their enemies, also bred a certain complacency, a reinforcing of existing biases. They believed they had the formula for aerial warfare perfected. The idea that another nation, particularly one they often dismissed as industrially crude or lacking in sophisticated design, could produce something truly revolutionary, seemed almost laughable. Then came the grind of the Eastern Front, the Battle of Britain, and eventually, the full might of the Allied industrial machine. Suddenly, the war wasn't just about quick, decisive victories. It was about attrition, about sustained combat, about sheer numbers and resilience. And as American forces entered the fray, they brought with them a new breed of aircraft, born of a different philosophy, shaped by different priorities. These were machines built not just for speed and agility, but for range, for carrying heavy loads, and crucially, for surviving incredible punishment. Among these new arrivals, none embodied this shift more profoundly than the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The P-47's journey from drawing board to battle was itself a testament to American industrial ambition. Designed by the visionary Russian-born engineer Alexander Kartveli, and built by Republic Aviation, the Thunderbolt was conceived not as a sleek, minimalist fighter, but as a heavily armed, robust war. Kartveli's initial designs were ambitious, pushing the boundaries of what was thought possible for a single-engine fighter. He wanted power, lots of it, and that meant a huge engine. The heart of the P-47, and indeed the key to its legendary power, was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. This wasn't just any engine, it was a behemoth. An 18-cylinder, it was capable of churning out over 2,000 horsepower, a figure that would eventually climb to 2,800 horsepower with water injection in later variants. To put that into perspective, the most powerful German inline engines of the time, like the Daimler-Benz DB605, typically produced around 1,400 to 1,800 horsepower. The R2800 was a beast, an engineering marvel in its own right. Renowned for its reliability and its ability to absorb damage and keep running. But simply having a powerful engine wasn't enough. Kartveli faced immense challenges, integrating such a massive power plant into a fighter airframe. The engine alone weighed over 2,300 pounds. To harness its power effectively, the P-47 needed a huge propeller, sometimes up to 13 feet in diameter, which necessitated a long landing gear to provide ground clearance. All this added weight. And from the outset, the P-47 was a heavy aircraft, earning it the affectionate nickname the Jug from its pilots, short for Juggernaut. Kartveli didn't shy away from the weight. Instead, he embraced it. He understood that a powerful engine could overcome the disadvantages of weight, especially at higher altitudes and in dives. He also used the generous dimensions of the fuselage to incorporate another critical piece of technology, a turbo super. Unlike most fighters that used engine-driven superchargers, the P-47's turbo supercharger was located in the rear fuselage, with a long duct running from the engine to the turbine and back to the engine. This complex system allowed the R2800 to maintain its immense power output even at very high altitudes, where the air was thin and other engines struggled. This was a crucial advantage for escorting bombers flying at 25,000 feet or higher. The P-47 was also built tough. Incredibly tough. Its airframe was designed to withstand the stresses of high-speed dives and aggressive maneuvers. It featured heavy-gauge metal skin, robust internal structures, and a generous amount of armor plating around the cockpit, protecting the pilot from ground fire and enemy cannon shells. It had self-sealing fuel tanks and redundant control systems. The philosophy was clear. Bring the pilot home, even if the plane looked like Swiss cheese. When the Thunderbolt first appeared over Europe in early 1943, German pilots and intelligence officers were initially somewhat dismissive. It was big, it looked heavy, and compared to their sleek Messerschmitts, it seemed almost crude. They focused on its perceived weaknesses. Its relatively slow climb rate at lower altitudes, and its wider turning radius compared to the Bf-109. German propaganda quickly seized on these points, portraying the P-47 as a clumsy, unsophisticated aircraft, easily out. But as combat reports started to filter back, a different picture began to emerge. German pilots quickly learned to respect the P-47's incredible diving speed. It could accelerate in a dive like almost nothing else, easily leaving a pursuing Bf-109 or FW-190 behind. They also discovered its resilience. Time and again, P-47s would return to base, riddled with holes. Entire sections of their fuselage or wings shot away, yet still flying. And then there was the armament. 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, mounted in the wings. Each gun fired a heavy projectile at a blistering rate. And with 8 of them firing simultaneously, the P-47 could unleash a torrent of lead that could tear apart enemy fighters and shred ground targets with devastating efficiency. This was firepower on a scale the Germans simply didn't equip their single-engine fighters with. Their fighters typically carried a mix of 20mm cannons and 7.92mm or 13mm machine guns. Fewer in number, and often with less sustained rate of fire. The true moment of reckoning for German engineers came when they finally got their hands on a relatively intact P-47. Details are often fuzzy, but several Thunderbolts were captured during the war, usually due to forced landings caused by battle damage, fuel exhaustion, or pilot error over occupied territory or German soil. One such event would have been a prized find. Imagine the scene: a battered but largely complete P-47, perhaps a P-47D model, sitting on a flatbed train car, making its way to a clandestine Luftwaffe test facility. Like Rechlin was the heart of the Luftwaffe's aircraft development and testing. It was a sprawling complex of hangars, runways, and workshops, staffed by some of Germany's brightest aeronautical minds. When the captured Thunderbolt arrived, there would have been a mix of excitement, curiosity, and perhaps a touch of disdain. Here was a chance to truly understand the enemy, to pick apart their technology, and uncover their secrets. Teams of engineers, led by senior project managers and technical specialists, would have gathered around the massive aircraft. They'd have initially approached it with their ingrained German perspective, looking for elegant solutions, for lightweight efficiency, for the kind of precision engineering they prided themselves on. Their initial impressions would have likely reinforced some of their preconceptions. "Look how big it is," someone might have exclaimed. "So much unnecessary bulk." Another might have pointed to the radial engine, shaking their head. "Such drag. Our inline engines are far superior for speed." They might have mocked the seemingly simplistic layout of some of the American systems, accustomed as they were to their own, often more complex, sometimes overly engineered, solutions. But then, the disassembly would begin. This wasn't a quick one. This was a meticulous, painstaking process. Every panel would be removed, every rivet examined, every wire traced. Photographs would be taken, measurements recorded, materials analyzed. As the P-47 slowly yielded its secrets, piece by piece, the initial arrogance would have started to fade, replaced by a growing sense of awe, then concern. The first major revelation, and arguably the most significant, would have come with the engine. When the cowling was finally removed, exposing the massive R2800 double wasp, the German engineers would have been confronted with a level of power generation they simply didn't have in production. They would have studied its 18 cylinders, its intricate valve train, its cooling fins, its robust construction. They would have seen the sheer scale of it, the engineering required to reliably produce such immense horsepower. They would have analyzed the supercharging system, tracing the long ducting to the turbo supercharger nestled in the aft fuselage. This complex, heavy but incredibly effective system allowed the P-47 to maintain its power output at altitudes where German fighters, without similar systems, would start to gasp for air. One can almost hear the discussions in the workshops. 2,000 horsepower, unbelievable. How do they cool it? How do they manage the fuel consumption? They knew their own BMW 801 radio, used in the FW190, was a powerful engine, but it typically produced around 1,600 to 1,700 HP. The R2800 was in a different league entirely. It was not just more powerful, it was also incredibly rugged. They would have noted the robust construction, the quality of the metallurgy, designed for endurance and reliability under extreme stress. This engine was built to take a beating and keep running. A testament to American manufacturing capabilities and their emphasis on battlefield resilience. This was a stark contrast to some German designs, which, while powerful, could sometimes be temperamental or prone to overheating if not meticulously maintained. Then came the airframe. As they stripped away the outer skin, they would have seen the internal structure: thick spars, heavy ribs, multiple redundancies. The Thunderbolt was not lightly built. It was a tank with wings. They would have examined the armor plating around the cockpit, the self-sealing fuel tanks, the robust landing gear. They would have seen how the hydraulic lines and control cables were routed, often in duplicate, to minimize the chance of a single hit disabling the aircraft. This was a plane designed to survive, to bring its pilot home, even after sustaining damage that would cripple a Bf-109. German engineers, used to maximizing performance through lightness, would have been forced to acknowledge the wisdom of this approach, especially for an aircraft operating deep behind enemy lines. The sheer amount of metal, the quality of the welds, the consistency of the manufacturing, it all spoke of an industrial capacity and a design philosophy focused on durability that was truly eye-opening. They might have thought about their own pilots, often flying aircraft that were far more vulnerable to battle damage, and felt a pang of envy, or perhaps fear. The armament, too, would have been a revelation. 8.50 caliber machine guns. When they examined the synchronized firing mechanisms, the ammunition feeds, and the sheer volume of rounds each gun could carry, the implication was clear. This plane was a flying shredder. The .50 caliber round was known for its destructive power, capable of tearing through aircraft structures, disabling engines, and devastating ground targets. German fighters, while often equipped with heavier caliber cannons, typically carried fewer of them and less ammunition. The P-47's sustained hail of .50 caliber fire was a different kind of threat, a wall of lead that was incredibly difficult to evade. The engineers would have marveled at the robust gun mounts, designed to absorb the recoil from such a powerful battery of weapons, ensuring accuracy and stability during combat. Beyond the major components, the smaller details would also have contributed to the overall impression. The quality of the avionics, the robust radio systems, the clear and functional cockpit layout, the oxygen system designed for high-altitude endurance. Everything pointed to an aircraft designed for long-range missions, for sustained combat, and for pilot comfort and survivability. It wasn't just raw power. It was power intelligently packaged and protected. They would have noted the meticulous wiring, the quality of the instruments, the ease of access for maintenance in many areas, all signs of a mature and efficient manufacturing process. As the analysis progressed, the initial German dismissiveness would have evaporated completely. They weren't just looking at an enemy plane anymore. They were looking at a completely different approach to aerial warfare, one that prioritized overwhelming power, ruggedness, and pilot protection over the more delicate balance of speed and agility that had defined their own fighter designs. The German test pilots who would have flown the captured Thunderbolt, if it was deemed airworthy after reassembly, would have confirmed the engineers' findings. They would have reported on its incredible diving speed, its stability at high altitude, its ability to maintain power in thin air, and its surprising maneuverability at high speeds. They would have felt the raw thrust of that R2800 engine, the sheer momentum of the Juggernaut dive, and understood why it was so difficult to shake once it had you in its sights. They would have experienced firsthand the feeling of being encased in a fortress, knowing that the plane could take hits and still keep flying. This wasn't a fragile, nimble dancer. It was a powerful, relentless brawler. The core realization, the moment of admission, would have been a gradual but undeniable consensus among the German engineers. It wasn't just one component. It was the sum of its parts. The colossal power of the R2800 engine, the almost indestructible airframe, the devastating firepower of the 8.50 caliber machine guns, the high-altitude performance thanks to the turbosoup, and the comprehensive pilot protection, all integrated into a single, cohesive, and incredibly effective weapon system. They would have sat in their debriefings, perhaps in a smoke-filled room, surrounded by blueprints and technical reports, and conceded. They would have looked at their own designs, the Bf-109s and the FW-190s, and seen them for what they were. Brilliant in their own right, but built for a different kind of war, a war of quick strikes and limited engagement. The Thunderbolt represented something else entirely. It was a product of an industrial behemoth, designed for sustained, brutal combat across vast distances. The phrase "we've never seen power," like it wouldn't have just referred to the engine's horsepower. It would have encompassed the sheer power projection of the aircraft, the ability to carry such a potent engine, with such heavy armament, encased in such a durable airframe, and operate effectively at such high altitudes for long durations. It was a holistic power, a combination of raw force and incredible resilience that allowed it to dictate terms in the skies. It was the power to escort bombers for hundreds of miles, to engage enemy fighters, and then to descend and strafe ground targets with impunity, absorbing damage and still returning home. This was an uphill battle. They were always playing catch-up. While the FW-190D was an excellent aircraft, it arrived late in the war and never in sufficient numbers to stem the tide. German industry, already strained by strategic bombing and resource shortages, simply couldn't produce these advanced variants fast enough to replace losses and counter the ever-growing numbers of Allied aircraft. The sheer industrial capacity of the United States, churning out thousands of P-47s, P-51s, and other aircraft every month, was something Germany simply could not match. The P-47's robust design, while making it heavy, also made it relatively straightforward to manufacture in large quantities, contributing to America's overwhelming production advantage. Beyond upgrading existing designs, German engineers also pursued entirely new concepts. The TA-152, as mentioned earlier, was Kurt Tank's attempt to create a high-altitude interceptor, specifically designed to tackle the threat posed by Allied bomber formations and their escorts. It was larger, had a longer wingspan, a pressurized cockpit, and a powerful engine with a sophisticated supercharging system, making it faster and more capable at high altitudes than its FW-190 predecessors. In many ways, the TA-152 embodied a German realization that they needed to embrace some of the characteristics of the P-47, more power, better high-altitude performance, and increased structural integrity, albeit within their own design philosophy. However, only a handful of TA-152s were ever produced. Again, too little, too late. The ultimate German answer to the P-47 and the P-51, of course, was the jet fighter. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, offered a revolutionary leap in speed. Its twin Jumo 004 jet engines propelled it to speeds far exceeding any piston-engine aircraft. Had it been deployed earlier and in greater numbers, and used purely as a fighter, it might have had a more significant impact. But its development was plagued by political interference, technical issues, and the relentless pressure of Allied air superiority, which made testing and production incredibly difficult. Even the Me-262, with all its speed, still faced challenges against the ruggedness and overwhelming numbers of the P-47. A single burst from 8.50 caliber machine guns, if it connected, could still bring down a jet, and the jets were far more vulnerable during takeoff and landing. The never-seen power like its sentiment from the German engineers wasn't just about the engine or the armament. It was about the entire philosophy behind the P-47. It was an aircraft built to withstand the realities of total war, where attrition, durability, and overwhelming force were often more critical than elegant agility. This philosophical divide between the two warring nations was stark. German engineering often leaned towards sophisticated, sometimes complex, solutions aimed at maximizing performance through efficiency and lightness. American engineering, especially in the context of wartime production, often prioritized robustness, reliability, ease of manufacture, and sheer brute force. The P-47 was the epitome of the latter. Consider the turbo supercharger system again. The Germans, with their inline engines, typically used mechanical superchargers driven directly by the engine. These were effective, but they sapped engine power and their performance dropped off significantly at very high altitudes. The P-47's exhaust-driven turbo supercharger, located far back in the fuselage, was a complex, heavy piece of engineering. It required long, intricate ducting for both exhaust gases and pressurized air, adding weight and complexity. But it was incredibly effective. It allowed the R2800 engine to maintain its phenomenal power output, even at 30,000 feet and above, precisely where bomber formations were operating and where German fighters often struggled. This was a clear example of American engineers being willing to add weight and complexity for a specific, crucial performance advantage. Sustained high-altitude power. German engineers, analyzing this system, would have recognized the brilliance of the solution. Even if it went against their own ingrained preferences for compactness and lightness, they might have even considered how such a system could be adapted to their own designs. But again, the war was already turning, and resources were dwindling. The difference in industrial approach was also critical. The United States had the raw materials, the manufacturing infrastructure, and the labor force to produce aircraft like the P-47 in staggering numbers. The design of the P-47, while sophisticated, also lent itself to mass production. Components were often designed for robust assembly rather than intricate, labor-intensive fitting. This allowed American factories to churn out these complex machines at an astonishing rate. Germany, by contrast, was increasingly resource-starved, its factories bombed, and its skilled labor diverted to other fronts. Even if they had fully grasped the P-47's design philosophy early on, they would have struggled to replicate its production volume. The captured Thunderbolt, stripped bare and analyzed, therefore became more than just a piece of enemy hardware. It became a mirror reflecting Germany's own vulnerabilities and the overwhelming strength of its adversary. It forced a revaluation of what was truly important in aerial combat. Was it the elegant, nimble fighter, or the robust, powerful warhorse that could take a punch and keep fighting? The P-47, with its undeniable combat record, made a compelling case for the latter. Its legacy extends beyond its combat effectiveness. The Thunderbolt helped redefine the role of the fighter aircraft. It showed that a single-engine fighter could be a versatile, long-range platform, capable of heavy bombing and ground attack, setting a precedent for future multi-role combat aircraft. Its influence can be seen in the design philosophy of later generations of robust, powerful fighter bombers. When the war ended, the P-47 had flown more than 500,000 combat sorties, destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground, and contributed immensely to Allied air superiority. It achieved this not through sleek elegance or unparalleled agility, but through sheer, uncompromising power and a resilience that bordered on the miraculous. It was, in essence, an airborne manifestation of American industrial might. A flying fortress that struck fear into the hearts of its enemies and instilled unwavering confidence in its pilots. The German engineers who painstakingly dissected that captured Thunderbolt learned a harsh but undeniable truth. Sometimes, the most effective solution isn't the most beautiful or the most delicate, but simply the most powerful, the most robust, and the most determined to endure. They admitted they'd never seen power like it, because they hadn't. They had been exposed to a different kind of engineering, a different kind of war, and a different kind of formidable foe. And that, in essence, is the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt. A plane that forced even its most advanced enemies to rethink everything they thought they knew about aerial warfare. The German engineers' grudging admiration for the P-47 wasn't just an isolated incident of technical assessment. It was part of a larger, more unsettling pattern of realization within the Luftwaffe and the broader German military machine. As the war progressed, the Allies introduced more and more aircraft that embodied similar philosophies of power, range, and resilience. The P-51 Mustang, for instance, combined the P-47's long range and heavy armament with exceptional speed and agility. Especially at high altitudes, thanks to its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The Germans found themselves constantly having to react, to try and innovate faster and harder, but always starting from a position of disadvantage. The P-47 was arguably the first major shock, the initial crack in their armor of perceived technological superiority. The very concept of a heavy fighter was something the Luftwaffe had explored, but never quite embraced with the same commitment as the Americans. German twin-engine heavy fighters, like the Messerschmitt Bf 110, proved vulnerable to single-engine Allied fighters, especially after the Battle of Britain. Their own single-engine designs, as discussed, prioritized agility and climb rate. The P-47, however, demonstrated that a single-engine aircraft could be massive, heavily armed, incredibly durable, and still perform exceptionally well in its intended roles. It was a paradigm shift that challenged their fundamental assumptions about fighter design. One crucial aspect that the German engineers would have observed, which tied directly into the P-47's power, was its ability to carry a massive fuel load. While the P-47 was known for its initial thirsty concept of air power that was, in its comprehensive application, truly new to them, this wasn't just a technical observation, it was a strategic one. The P-47 wasn't just a fighter, it was a symbol of American industrial might and a different approach to aerial combat. It showed that building a heavier, more powerful, more survivable aircraft, even if it sacrificed some agility, could be incredibly effective, especially in the context of long-range bomber escort and ground attack missions. It highlighted a significant gap in German aircraft development, particularly in high-horsepower radial engines, and the structural robustness to match. The impact of this realization on German strategic thinking and aircraft development was profound. It spurred renewed efforts to develop more powerful engines, to improve structural integrity, and to equip their own fighters with heavier armament. The TA-152, a high-altitude interceptor developed by Kurt Tank, the designer of the FW-190, was in many ways a direct response to the threat posed by Allied heavy fighters like the P-47 and P-51. The TA-152 was significantly larger and heavier than its predecessors, with a powerful engine and long wings designed for high-altitude performance, echoing some of the P-47's own design principles, albeit with an inline engine. The desperate push for advanced jet aircraft like the Me-262 also gained urgency, as German strategists realized that piston engine technology, at least in the Allied hands, was reaching new, terrifying heights. The German engineers' assessment of the P-47 Thunderbolt was a moment of profound clarity in a war often shrouded in propaganda and wishful thinking. It was a cold, hard evaluation of an enemy machine that forced them to confront the limitations of their own philosophy and the formidable capabilities of their adversary. The Jug wasn't just a fighter, it was a flying statement of American industrial power, engineering prowess, and a relentless will to win. It was a machine that defied their expectations and ultimately earned their grudging respect, proving that raw power, when intelligently applied and protected, could indeed win the day. The Thunderbolt played a crucial role in securing air superiority for the Allies, escorting bombers and devastating ground targets, and it did so with a level of power and resilience that left even its enemies in awe. If you found this deep dive into aviation history fascinating, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next video. The Thunderbolt played a crucial role in securing air superiority for the Allies, escorting bombers and devastating ground targets, and it did so with a level of power and resilience that left even its enemies in awe. This wasn't just theoretical admiration in a hangar. It translated directly into the brutal reality of aerial combat over the unforgiving skies of Europe. Pilots flying the P-47 quickly discovered its unique strengths and learned to exploit them to devastating effect against the Luft. One of the P-47's most defining operational roles was long-range bomber escort. Early in the war, American heavy bombers, like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberty, were being shot down in alarming numbers by German fighters as they ventured deep into enemy territory beyond the range of their shorter-legged escorts. The P-47, with its immense internal fuel capacity and the ability to carry external drop tanks, could fly alongside the bombers for hundreds of miles, all the way to targets in Germany and back. This was a game-changer. German pilots, who had previously enjoyed free rein after the shorter-range Spitfires and Bf-109s had to turn back, now found themselves facing a formidable opponent deep over their own homeland. The P-47's tactics were often dictated by its strengths. While it wasn't the most agile dogfighter in a slow, turning battle, it excelled in high-speed vertical maneuvers. P-47 pilots would often employ boom and zoom tactics, diving on enemy formations at incredible speed, firing their 8.50 caliber machine guns, and then using their momentum to climb back to altitude, ready for another pass. This frustrated German pilots immensely. A Bf-109 or FW-190 might be able to outturn a Thunderbolt at lower speeds, but they simply couldn't match its diving speed or its ability to regain altitude rapidly. If a German pilot tried to follow a diving P-47, they risked overstressing their own aircraft or simply being outrun. The sheer weight and structural integrity of the Thunderbolt meant it could pull out of dives that would tear the wings off lighter aircraft. Stories from Allied pilots are filled with accounts of the P-47's incredible resilience. There are countless reports of Thunderbolts returning to base with entire sections of their wings missing, fuselages riddled with cannon holes, engines sputtering but still running, and even missing parts of their tail. One particularly famous incident involved a P-47 pilot, whose aircraft was hit so severely that half of its tailplane was gone. Despite this, the rugged aircraft held together, and the pilot managed to nurse it back to safety. This wasn't an isolated event. It was a common theme. The robust construction, the redundant systems, the powerful radial engine that could absorb significant damage to its cylinders and still function. These features all contributed to an astonishingly high rate of pilot survival, even when their aircraft were severely mauled. This resilience not only saved lives, but also instilled a deep confidence in the pilots, who knew their Jug could take a beating and still get them home. For German pilots, this was a demoralizing reality. They would expend precious ammunition and risk their own lives to get hits on a P-47, only to watch it continue flying, sometimes even smoking, but stubbornly refusing to fall out of the sky. This psychological impact was immense. Imagine the frustration of hitting an enemy aircraft multiple times with 20mm cannon shells, seeing sparks and debris, only for it to continue its attack or fly away. It wasn't just a physical battle, it was a war of attrition on the spirit. German fighter pilots were already facing numerical superiority, diminishing supplies, and increasingly effective Allied air tactics. To then face an aircraft that seemed almost indestructible added another layer of despair. The P-47's role wasn't limited to air-to-air combat. As the war progressed, especially after D-Day, its ground attack capabilities became legendary, with its 8.50 caliber machine guns, which could carry over 3,400 rounds in total. The P-47 was a devastating platform for strafing enemy troops, vehicles, and trains. It could also carry an impressive array of bombs and rockets, up to 2,500 pounds of ordnance, allowing it to act as a formidable fighter bomber. Its rugged construction, combined with pilot armor, made it surprisingly resistant to ground fire, a crucial advantage when flying low and slow over enemy positions. German ground forces quickly learned to fear the distinctive roar of the Thunderbolt's engine, knowing that a Jug meant trouble from the sky. This dual role, excelling both as a high-altitude fighter escort and a potent ground attack aircraft, highlighted the versatility born from its core design philosophy, power, and resilience. It wasn't a specialized tool. It was a multi-purpose war machine, capable of adapting to the evolving demands of the battlefield. This adaptability was another facet that German engineers would have observed, realizing that their own specialized designs, while excellent in their niche, lacked the broad utility of the American Thunderbolt. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109 was a superb interceptor, but a poor ground attack platform. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 was more versatile, but still couldn't match the P-47's sheer ordnance, capacity, or its high-altitude performance without significant modifications. The German attempts to counter the P-47 and other Allied heavy fighters were a testament to their own engineering prowess under immense pressure, but also to their growing desperation. They tried various approaches. One was to improve their existing aircraft. The Bf-109 continued through numerous variants, with more powerful engines and heavier armament, but its basic airframe, designed for lightness, struggled to integrate these additions without compromising its flight characteristics. The FW-190 also saw continuous upgrades, with later models featuring more powerful radial engines, like the BMW 801D2 and the more powerful 801E, or even liquid-cooled inline engines, like the FW-190D Dora series, which used the Junkers Jumo 2. These Doras were powerful and fast at medium to high altitudes, designed specifically to counter Allied escorts. They were a direct response to the aerial environment created by aircraft like the P-47. However, even these improved German fighters faced an engine Later variants and the addition of external drop tanks significantly extended its operational range. This wasn't just about flying farther. It was about staying longer over the target area, providing continuous escort for bombers, or lingering over ground targets for sustained attacks. German fighters, by contrast, often had limited internal fuel capacity, meaning shorter loiter times and less flexibility in combat. The sheer volume of fuel the P-47 could carry was a direct consequence of its large airframe and the power of its engine, which needed that fuel to maintain its performance. This allowed American air commanders far greater tactical flexibility, something the Germans increasingly lacked. Beyond the technical specifics, the P-47 symbolized a larger strategic failure for Germany, underestimating the industrial capacity and innovative spirit of the United States. Before the war, and even in its early stages, many German strategists dismissed America as a land of crude mass production, lacking the sophisticated engineering of Europe. The Thunderbolt, along with other American war materiel, shattered that illusion. It proved that American industry could not only produce in vast quantities, but could also innovate with designs that were both incredibly effective and remarkably robust. The P-47 wasn't a cheap, quickly built throwaway. It was a highly sophisticated, complex machine that was nonetheless built to endure and to be produced efficiently. The German engineers dissecting the Thunderbolt were not just looking at metal and wires. They were looking at the future of aerial warfare and the immense resources backing it. They were seeing a country that could afford to build such a robust, powerful, and therefore expensive aircraft in numbers that dwarfed anything Germany could hope to achieve. This disparity in resources and production capability became increasingly apparent as the war dragged on, and the P-47 was a tangible, flying embodiment of that disparity. The psychological impact on the German leadership, beyond the engineers, was also significant. Commanders on the eastern and western fronts would have received intelligence reports detailing the Thunderbolt's performance, its resilience, and its devastating ground attack capabilities. This would have contributed to the growing sense of dread and inevitability that began to permeate the German high command as the war turned against them. The skies, once dominated by the Luftwaffe, were now swarming with increasingly powerful and seemingly indestructible Allied aircraft, with the P-47 leading the charge in many sectors. The legacy of the P-47 also extends to its influence on post-war aircraft design. The lessons learned from building and operating such a heavy, powerful, and durable fighter were not forgotten. The concept of a multi-role fighter bomber, capable of carrying a significant ordnance load and surviving heavy battle damage, became a cornerstone of military aviation. While jet engines soon superseded piston engines, the underlying principles of robust construction, powerful propulsion, and versatile armament, so brilliantly demonstrated by the P-47, continued to shape aircraft development for decades. Modern attack aircraft, designed to operate in contested airspace and deliver heavy firepower, owe a conceptual debt to the Jug. Ultimately, the story of the German engineers taking apart a captured Thunderbolt and admitting they'd never seen power like it is a powerful microcosm of the larger conflict. It represents the clash of ideologies, the raw force of industrial might, and the often brutal process of technological evolution driven by war. It's a moment of truth, a stark realization that the enemy they had underestimated was capable of producing machines of war that defied their expectations and fundamentally altered the balance of power in the skies. The P-47 wasn't just an airplane. It was a turning point in perception, a testament to American ingenuity, and a symbol of the relentless, overwhelming force that ultimately led to the Allied victory. It proved that sometimes, the simplest, most direct application of massive power and brute strength can be the most revolutionary. And that, truly, is a power worth remembering. If you enjoyed this journey into the heart of World War II aviation, hit that subscribe button to join us for more incredible stories.